Hey, welcome back to the channel. What I'm about to break down may sound unbelievable at first, but the consequences are very real. A single decision from Washington, aimed at punishing Canada, has quietly begun to backfire inside the US economy in ways few expected. On October 26, 2025, President Trump imposed a 10% tariff on all Canadian imports, calling Ontario's anti-tariff ad campaign.
Doug Ford, he's the feisty Ontario premier who refuses to kiss the ring. So now President Trump is slapping an extra 10% tariff on imports from Canada. Premier Ford taking President Trump's hero and basically using it against him.
In a hostile act. But beneath the political noise, something far more disruptive was happening. Shipments stalled, retail prices jumped, and American exporters, not Canadians, were suddenly the ones taking the hit from their own government's move. Within days, more than 40% of U.S. export orders to Canada were suspended. Supply chains of liquor, consumer goods, and auto parts went.
When I go to the grocery store, I look for the Canadian, the little maple leaf that a lot of grocery stores have put on the shelves to, try and purchase Canadian items or Mexican items, anything other than the United States.
Dark almost overnight. Analysts at Brookings later described it as a reverse trade shock, the moment when the economic weapon designed for pressure swung back toward the hand that launched it. The tariff was meant to make Canada pay. Instead, it exposed an uncomfortable truth about this era of global interdependence. Every tariff eventually returns home that so how did this political gamble unravel so quickly? And why did it end up hurting the United States first? Before we get into that, make sure to hit the like button. It helps us.
So, after all the backlash, I have to ask you, you sure know how to push President Trump's buttons. Do you regret running this ad in any way, shape, or form?
I don't regret it at all. My intention was to make sure the American people were informed and have a conversation, and it really started a conversation.
Video reached more people who need to understand the real story behind these economic standoffs. Here's where the whole situation takes an unexpected turn. The spark that ignited this entire dispute didn't come from Washington at all. It began in Toronto. The catalyst was an ad, a massive $75 million media campaign launched by Ontario Premier Doug Ford. Bold, provocative, and impossible to ignore, it delivered a message drawn straight from Ronald Reagan's 1987 warning. High tariffs always trigger retaliation and ignite trade wars. The ad spread everywhere in a matter of hours, from CNN to Fox News, flooding American airwaves and social feeds with a jarring reminder of history. In just 2 weeks, it hit more than 1 billion global impressions, but the shock wasn't in the reach of the campaign. It was in its impact. Ford likely knew his message would provoke a reaction, but he may not have anticipated just how deeply it would unsettle the White House. President Trump lashed out publicly, calling the campaign a fraud ad that damaged America's image. Days later, he retaliated with a now infamous 10% tariff. Ford's response was sharp and unapologetic. If he had created that much anger, then it struck exactly where it needed to. Some analysts later described the campaign as the first visual counterstrike in North American trade history, an advertisement that didn't just shape public opinion, but forced the world's most powerful government to respond. Still with us? If so, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Rather than backing down, Canadians turned attention into unity. What started as a political dispute transformed into a nationwide consumer movement, spreading from supermarket aisles to factory floors. A simple phrase captured the mood across the country: by Canadian. According to an Angus Reid survey in February 2025, 85% of Canadians said they were already replacing or planning to replace American goods with domestic alternatives. Another 78% pledged to purchase more Canadian-made products, while 59% committed to boycotting U.S. brands altogether. Retailers moved quickly to support the momentum. Major chains like Sobeys, Metro, and Longo's introduced bold red and white made in Canada labels across their shelves, turning everyday shopping into an act of national solidarity. Online, the Buy Canadian Facebook group surged past 1.2 million members, transforming scattered consumer choices into a coordinated economic movement. But beneath the surface, something much deeper than buying habits was shifting. A Ledger poll revealed that 81% of Canadians were choosing local products not because of price, but because of pride. In just a few weeks, everyday consumption had become a symbol of resistance. proof that loyalty, not legislation, was powering Canada's most significant economic realignment in decades. That Washington's retaliation wasn't met with fear. It unified Canadians. What began as political friction evolved into a countrywide movement defined by confidence, defiance, and a shared belief that supporting Canadian workers was the best response to external pressure. In a short time, Buy Canadian stopped being a slogan and became a national instinct. According to an Angus Reid survey conducted in February 2025, an overwhelming shift had already begun inside Canada. Nearly 85% of Canadians said they were replacing or planning to replace American products with domestic alternatives. Another 78% pledged to increase their purchases of Canadian-made goods, while almost 6 in 10 openly stated they intended to boycott U.S. brands altogether. Across the country, this wasn't just a change in shopping habits. It was the early spark of a national realignment. Supermarket chains such as Sobeys, Metro, and Longo's moved quickly to meet the moment. They rolled out prominent red and white made in Canada labels across their aisles, transforming routine grocery trips into quiet acts of economic solidarity. What began as a response to a political dispute grew into a wider cultural shift. Online, the Buy Canadian Facebook community surged past 1.2 million members, evolving from a consumer preference into a civic statement, one that redefined how Canadians saw themselves in a moment of tension. Even price-conscious shoppers began reassessing their priorities. A Ledger poll revealed that 81% of respondents were buying local not because of cost, but because of pride. In just a few weeks, what started as a backlash to a tariff had morphed into something deeper, an identity movement. It was reshaping how an entire country thought about what it consumes, whom it supports, and what national loyalty looks like in a globalized world. By late summer, the shift had moved from the streets and stores into the halls of government. The Buy Canadian slogan, once a grassroots rallying cry, transformed into official doctrine. On September 5, 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before Parliament and announced a sweeping directive. Every government-funded project would be required to prioritize Canadian suppliers first. The message was unmistakable. Economic sovereignty was no longer a theme. It was a strategy. The effects were immediate and widespread. Domestic manufacturers saw demand surge at levels not recorded in decades. Irving Personal Care, a New Brunswick-based producer, reported a fourfold increase in weekly shipments, fueled almost entirely by provincial and federal procurement programs. Retailers followed the same direction. Sobeys projected a substantial decline in U.S. goods across its supply chain, as major supermarket groups committed to sourcing Canadian products whenever possible. The Ottawa's economic framework rested on 3 major pillars. First, the government moved to harmonize economic standards across provinces, aiming to create a seamless internal market capable of competing with larger global blocs. Second, defense spending was raised to 2% of GDP, ensuring Canada's industrial base could serve both civilian and national security needs. Third, trade partnerships across Europe were expanded, opening channels designed to reduce reliance on North American supply chains. Analysts call this the post-American pivot, the most significant structural shift in Canadian economic strategy in half a century. For the first time in generations, Ottawa wasn't shaping policy in response to U.S. pressure. It was charting its own course, one based on resilience rather than rivalry. While Canada was consolidating its priorities, the long-standing alliance that had defined North America for decades began to strain. Supply chains once shared, defense agreements once unquestioned, and borders once fluid were now overshadowed by open competition and diverging interests. The U.S. pressure campaign intended to bring Canada back into alignment had the opposite effect. It reinforced Ottawa's determination to move independently. In a defining address, Prime Minister Carney stated bluntly, "The era of deep economic and security integration has ended." It wasn't a rejection of the United States, it was a recalibration. Canada matched its words with action, exploring European alternatives for fighter jets and signing 5 new energy and mineral agreements with EU nations in the second half of 2025. These initiatives redirected Canadian trade and investment toward markets less vulnerable to U.S. volatility. At the same time, global trends accelerated. As countries pursued friend-shoring strategies to secure their supply chains, Canada emerged as a dependable bridge between the West and Asia, stable, predictable, and increasingly essential. Ironically, the United States, which initiated the tariff confrontation, found itself more isolated. The walls it built for leverage became barriers that limited its own influence. What began as an attempt to pressure an ally ended as self-inflicted separation, subtly redrawing the balance of power in North America. The clash between Trump and Ford ultimately grew far beyond their initial political exchange. It evolved into a global cautionary tale. What started as a war of words became a mirror reflecting the realities of modern economics. In an interconnected world, every trade barrier eventually circles back to its origin. The confrontation shattered the old belief that protectionism could protect. Instead of shielding jobs, tariffs fractured trust, disrupted supply chains, and exposed vulnerabilities within domestic industries that had long relied on international cooperation.